In this video, I'd like to take up the topic of depression, which was suggested by a viewer, Krishnamurti. So many thanks to you, Krishnamurti, for that suggestion. Anyhow, to take up the topic of depression, it's probably a good idea first to make note of a distinction that appears fairly frequently within clinical psychological practice. Basically, depression appears clinically on a continuum that runs from its more somatic forms to its more episodic or situational forms. In other words, some types of depression have more to do with physiological factors, such as aberrations in neurotransmission, whereas others have to do more with what we're experiencing in life. Naturally, there's some overlap between these two types. However, in this video, I'd like to focus mostly on the latter type, the kind of depression that's rooted more in what we're experiencing rather than in physiological factors. I want to do this because exploring depression of this type is probably more interesting and relevant to viewers. However, for the same reason, I'd also like to stray somewhat from a strictly clinical treatment and take up depression in a more everyday way, in a way that opens upon a more varied vocabulary of depression, which would include terms like melancholy, dysphoria, sadness, despondency, feeling blue, etc. So, I'd like to begin by looking at one of the great depressive figures in literary history, the melancholic Dane himself, Hamlet. So the question is, why is the play Hamlet so popular despite its difficult, antiquated language? And why, after 400 years, does it continue to be produced over and over in modern film? There's the Sir Laurence Olivier version, the Mel Gibson version, the Kenneth Branagh version, the David Tennant version, and most recently, the Benedict Cumberbatch version. In fact, according to Wikipedia, there have been about 50 film adaptations of Hamlet since 1900. But when you look at the play itself, well, it's not exactly the feel-good blockbuster hit of the summer now, is it? Act 1. The king, Hamlet's father, has evidently been murdered by his brother, who has now married his mother. Then there's the question of Hamlet's madness. How much of it is real and how much of it is feigned? Or is it something that was feigned at first and then becomes more real as the play progresses? By Act 4, Hamlet's girlfriend, Ophelia, has herself gone mad and drowned, and Polonius, her father, has been killed by Hamlet semi-accidentally. By Act 5, the rest of the cast is dropping like flies. And by the end of Act 5, well, all of the remaining major characters lie dead on the stage. And then, at the very end of the play, an announcer minces onto the stage to tell the audience that two minor characters from earlier in the play, Rosencrantz and Guildenstern, have also been killed behind the scenes. And this is the play that everyone wants to see a new movie version of every few years. And so, the obvious question is, why? Well, okay. So the reason why Hamlet has been so popular for over 4 centuries can't be because it's such an obviously uplifting, heartwarming tale. Hamlet is perennially fascinating because its tragic themes of betrayal, madness, revenge, and death reflect the parts of reality that are actually like that. Hamlet, and tragic drama more generally, is popular because it's real, because it reflects life's tragic, difficult nature. And the crown jewel of the entire play, the famous "to be or not to be" soliloquy, which is perhaps the single most famous and powerful moment in the entire canon of English literature, is about contemplating suicide and poses the unsettling question about how any of us can manage to keep slogging through all of life's inevitable woe and travail. But this, too, is a reflection of life's reality because, among its other disparate charms, life is something tragic and painful. It's the same basic realization that underlies the first noble truth of Buddhism, which is that human existence entails a lot of suffering. The point is that these sorts of ideas, which seem so dark and morbid on the surface, are in reality expressing an important aspect of our humanity. And at some level, we all know it, even if it's difficult to admit. The fact is that we all have plenty of reason to be depressed, because to be human is to be caught up in the tragic web of life, in all of its myriad forms and incarnations. So, in a way, a depressive view of life embodies a kind of lucidity about how heavy and onerous our weight of days really is. And in the baleful glare of that kind of unsparing lucidity lies the power and also the seductiveness of depression. Of course, it's probably not so common to think that depression has anything to do with power. After all, common wisdom would tell us that depression is a mode of debilitation, a way of living out an attenuated relation to life. However, it seems to me that that's only a partial view. In fact, I'd say that it's impossible to understand depression without also realizing its power and its seductiveness too. The power of depression is first that, like dramatic tragedy, it allows us to see beyond all of the niceties and politesse that our culture affirms so easily. Depression's power is that it allows us to read the forbidden chapter of our lives, both individually and culturally. Human existence is, after all, often painful, oppressive, ponderous, absurd, nonsensical, and meaningless. Full of the whips and scorns of time, the oppressor's wrong, the proud man's contumely, the pangs of despised love, the law's delay, the insolence of office, and the spurns that patient merit of the unworthy takes. However, the second, more subtle arc of depression's power has to do with the hidden intimacy between what's dark and what's bright. The philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche expressed this pretty well when he wrote, "It is out of the deepest depth that the highest must come to its height." In other words, in order to truly know the day, we must also become intimately acquainted with the night. Our ability to perceive life's brilliance is always in a hidden romance with our ability to feel its darkness. That's because they're both expressions of something more fundamental, our human capacity for passion. As the German poet Rainer Maria Rilke once famously put it, "If my demons are to leave me, I am afraid that my angels will take flight as well." This principle of complementarity is also why human wisdom is more often born in our unsettling shadows than in the steady glare of rational illumination. It's because our contact with what is difficult, with what draws us to the desolate outer shore of what we think we can withstand, is what ultimately brings out the best in us. One place to glimpse this aspect of depression's power, as well as its relation to wisdom, is in its place within the process of grieving. Elizabeth Kubler-Ross, for instance, describes this pretty well. Of course, her theory is based upon her work with terminally ill patients. However, it seems to me that the same basic process probably plays out with respect to grieving in its more figurative sense. When we grieve for the loss of our youthful illusions, when we discover to our horror and chagrin that we've been born to this world with all of its suffering, absurdity, and injustice, rather than to the world of our idealized fantasies. And as we work our way through that devastating realization, probably most of us go through some sequence or combination of denial, anger, bargaining, and depression before we're finally able to accept and love life as it is. However, in addition to its underlying potency, the tragic sense of life also has its seductive charm. It's the allure of the gathering darkness, the setting of the summer sun on the dusky horizon, and the slowly approaching warm satin caress of the midnight sky, heavy with rain and the mournful requiem of distant thunder, rumbling like a funereal dirge over a landscape of infinite shadows and sorrow. It's this kind of dark aesthetic that lends depression its seductiveness. The unsettling fact is that depression is alluring in part because it's also a secret mode of beauty. So, the strength of depression lies first in its lucid recognition of the extent of life's pain and difficulty, and then in its complementary relation to everything that would seem to be its opposite, which in turn can serve as a conduit for genuine wisdom, and then, finally, in its seductive allure and aesthetic. However, its principal weakness lies in the fact that all of this yields only a partial view of life. After all, in addition to being burdensome, life is also exuberant, joyful, and ecstatic. And probably the largest fraction of our lives resides between those two extremes. So, The principal weakness of depression lies not in its being a mode of pathological debilitation, as common wisdom might tell us, but in its simple incompleteness. Of course, the same could be said of any other powerfully emotional experience, including that of happiness. All emotional experiences are ultimately just partial views, only pieces of life's overall picture. And the fact is that they all have their pluses and minuses. And this, I feel, is the key to living through periods of depression despite their obvious challenges. It's the realization that we're not here to experience only the nice parts of life. We're here to experience all of it. Life in all of its magnificence, but also in all of its terror, pain, and sorrow. So, it turns out that depression has its rightful place within the larger order of things. It's just another part of the human equation. And at the same time, our moments of depression will run their course with time, and eventually yield to life's other seasons. Spring must strike again against the shield of winter, as the rock band Genesis once said. So, all things considered, when we realize that depression is simply another part of the human experience, and that it's not any sort of final destination for our lives, and that it also offers us subtle gifts and powers, as well as its more obvious tensions and difficulties, well, then suddenly our depressive experiences can start to make a kind of sense. And along with that sense can come a kind of redeeming value. Have a great day.